Okay, you all good? Let's do it. Hello and welcome to the B2C Lead Generation Podcast. You're listening to the B2C Lead Gen Podcast. My name is Daniel Hopewell here with Simon Delaney, and this is episode 91, the C word. And that word today is compliance. And we are joined by Janine Paterson, the marketing law expert, who's going to be helping us try and dive into compliance today. Jean, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me on.
Thank you for coming. We appreciate it. So it's the first time we do talk about this kind of stuff before, but it's the first time we've had a real dive into compliance, and hopefully we'll pick up some new things we've not discussed before, which is always good. To get started, could you sort of explain what you do and how this relates to compliance for people listening?
Certainly. I basically provide advice to all sorts of brands and organizations on how to comply with all the rules that go around using data, but also doing lead gen in general. So I'm a solicitor. I've been qualified for 30 years. And basically for the last 15 years, I've been in this sort of area. I used to work for the Data and Marketing Association. Was there for 12 years. And for the last 3 years, I've run my own company. Basically, it means that I can actually advise a wider audience than just members of the association. So it's quite a interesting area and quite a niche, I think I would say.
I think just for full exposure, I've used us as a company have used your services before, and which were very good, by the way.
Thank you.
But at the time, I was speaking to one of my colleagues, Ben Long, and I can't remember what it was. We needed some contractual terms or privacy policy help on this landing page or something. And I'd said to him, part of the problem is that anyone we're sending it to doesn't know this world. So you spend most of your time trying to explain to them the mechanisms of how this works and why data gets passed. And he went, no. There's this lady, Janine, that we should speak to. She gets it all. She knows it all already. So that's why it's so great to have you on the podcast, because you're not here just from a compliance point of view and a legal standpoint of you actually understand the subject matter. And I think that's so important for people, that buying leads, generating leads, just being able to work with someone that they can talk on a level where they're like, oh, I get it. I understand what you're trying to achieve. And that's why it's a great niche to be in, I think.
Yes, it is quite a niche, but I have benefited quite a lot from a lot of information, and certainly my clients have helped educate me as well about the sort of the practicalities, which help to then put together with the legal side, and hopefully we get a good result.
Yeah.
So Janine, forgive me if this is too broad a question, but as I'm not in any way legal, and I imagine a lot of people who are listening may not be either, can you sort of just touch upon some of the kind of legal advice you're actually giving to your clients?
I can basically, there's two sort of elements to when you're doing your marketing and advertising. You obviously got the ICO, so you've got all the data protection side. So I advise clients on how to make sure that if they're collecting consent for doing something, how to do that with in accordance with GDPR. Also, like privacy policies, because obviously you need to tell people what you're going to do with their data. They need to be fully informed. So it's privacy policies, your data collection statement that actually tells people this is what we're going to do with it if you agree to it. And then you've got the other side, the ASA, the Advertising Standards Authority. They have codes which obviously govern your advertising out in the real world. So whether you're doing that through TV ads or competitions and just filling in forms. There are rules that they govern, obviously, which you need to comply with as well. So I sort of help on sort of various aspects on sort of most of them. I've got do a lot of stuff on like competitions, making sure that your competition terms are right and that you've got all the right permissions in there to be able to then use those people's data once the competition is ended, because obviously competition is a way to get leads. So you need to make sure that you're gaining the permission to actually talk to those people after the competition has ended. but also looking at privacy policies and making sure that data protection side of any lead gen is perfect and just what the brand or the company needs.
And I think some of the things that you touched on, especially around potentially the ASA and the opt-ins and things like that. So a lot of lead generators have one goal they're trying to achieve, which is to get as many clicks on an advert, let's say it was on Facebook or it's on Google, whatever, to go through to a landing page to fill that in, because then they make money for every time a lead's sold. And then you have the buyer on the other end whose ultimate aim is to get consented data of a person who's interested in their product and be able to sell to them. But there can be a massive juxtaposition between these 2 points, and it all starts with that advert, because that advert's not necessarily designed to make a sale, it's designed to make someone click it. And do you see that as a problem often?
There is, because obviously there is what you say in those adverts has to be obviously in accordance with the code. And I think there is a difference between trying to encourage people to click a link to go and enter a competition or give their details in exchange for something. And obviously, I think it's providing something of value to the person to say, well, if you do this, this is what you're going to get. And that's a lot to do with, I think, the way that certainly a lot of lead gen is going, and for some of my clients who sort of do it in a slightly different way, but certainly it's providing them with a very transparent process, and they know exactly what they're getting into before they click that button. There's no hidden things afterwards, which is, I think, used to be a bit of a problem. I don't know, maybe still a problem in some areas.
Yeah, I think the thing is, so with a competition, let's say, it can be typically like co-reg sites, can't it? Obviously brands and things like that might have promotion. And so the co-reg site is slightly different, because the mechanism of generating a lead is to do with like then going down a path within the co-reg site. But then you have like the Solace form fill, which is just a landing page for, I don't know, life insurance or something that someone's put together. But so what I've seen is adverts with I don't know, let's say a woman with a bra on, and it's been for equity release. We mentioned this in another podcast, and they've gone, equity release help pay for these bad boys. The person clicks it, they go through to an advertorial. That then explains something else, and then they go into a lead gen form. And someone sent this to me, and I was like, does the client know you're doing this? And they're like, no, they just think it's on that advertorial. I was like, this is unreal.
Wow.
Yeah.
Haven't seen that particular one, but there are very dubious ways that people seem to want to try and influence people to click a button for an end result. But the trouble is, you get people that click it mistakenly, and they end up on the other side, and they're not going to be very happy, I think, when they realize they've been duped maybe, and you then end up with a brand that might have a very bad view of it because of the way they've gone about doing that.
Yeah.
Do you know what? I put an idea to you? I'm not sure I necessarily agree with this idea. I'm just putting it out there because I know some people do. The ICO and the ASA, a lot of people, I think, have this perception that perhaps they don't always know what's going on. They maybe issue fines, but almost like on a scattergun approach. There's something of like a Russian roulette about it, that you may get caught, you may get away with it. Do you think that's fair? Do you think that they are aware of people who are sort of breaking the law, who are doing these things, or how are they identifying it and how are they issuing the fines?
I think there's an element of truth. I think they do know that there is bad practice out there, and obviously their aim is to just try and stop that. But the ICO seem to say that they're out there to teach companies how to do it properly. And they do a lot of that in terms of the education they do, but also they see that the monetary penalty notices they put out there do sort of help to educate people. The trouble is, I think, with both the ASA and the ICO is that they have limited funds, limited people to actually go after all the people that they really ought to be going after. Some of the latest ones, recent ones, where they've gone after companies that have been not only breaching the law, but also some very dubious practices as well, with there's a few where they were breaching TPS, but the actual way they did the phone calls were basically being aggressive and basically trying to push the products they were selling to people who were vulnerable and had been targeted as such. They've sort of been exposed, which is quite good. And it's one of the things I say to anybody, that you might get investigated for a particular failing, like failing to take into account the TPS. But once they get inside your business, they'll look at everything, and all sorts of things can come to the surface that you might not really want people to know about. So I think they're doing their best, but they don't have the resources and the manpower to actually go after all the people that are doing it wrong. They also need the people complaining about it, which is certainly the ASA as the same one. If they get a lot of complaints, they will obviously investigate, but they can, and I suppose to a certain extent the ICO does as well, they can decide to investigate something off their own bat. The ASA did one about the new gambling rules that came in October. An advert went out for Ladbrokes, which nobody complained about, but the ASA complained about it to themselves, and that was upheld complaint. So
I'd love to have been in that meeting where one guy sort of walked round to one side and walked.
But certainly, I suppose I would say that I think they're doing the best. I know there are some people that don't like the ICO. I don't know the difference in actual information commissioner has had a change of some people's view, but I think they're still they're doing their best with what they've got. I don't think, most companies, I think, if you're a small to medium enterprise, it's unlikely you'll get caught unless you do something really stupid, which is pretty obvious to everybody. But it's not a reason not to do the right thing, I suppose.
I think that's right. I mean, it's because we'll see instances of it, but it's, let's say, from a lead generator whose turnover is $250,000 a year, which is fine for them, but for the ICO, they've got their eyes on companies who are turning over multi-millions and, huge fines being issued. And so I think it can sort of slip under the radar. And this brings me nicely into just 2 points I wanted to ask you. So what we'll often see on landing page, and you get it a lot with co-registration sites, is co-sponsor, which is the partners tab, the opt-ins and whatever. What is the right way to do that? And because you'll see it on landing pages where it's a solace landing page for a particular product. So let's just say it was life insurance again, or broadband. And someone goes through, signs up to broadband. And then when they go to the end of their form, there'll be a tick box, or sometimes it's just written within the legitimate interest that is partners. And I think this is sometimes what can happen with the ICO, where there's sort of gray areas. And so people will make their own assumptions about those gray areas, and then they'll create the environment to exploit those gray areas, if you see what I mean. And you see some of them and think, this cannot be lawful, and it's one of these things where it's quite difficult to diagnose whether it is or not.
Certainly, if you're a co-sponsor, you are a third party, so you should have a separate opt-in. If you're gaining consent, then you need that. And certainly if you're a third party and you want to be able to send email, then you're going to have to use consent anyway. So legitimate interests isn't going to be enough. Obviously, if they were doing like direct mail, then that's probably okay. But certainly most people want the ability to either SMS or email. So any co-sponsor needs to have a separate opt-in mechanism on that form, rather than it being tied up. And that's one of the major problems I see with all sorts of lead magnets, free webinars, or download this white paper or whatever. Lots of people are putting at the bottom of it one sentence that basically says if you agree to if you want to go on the webinar or you want to download this, you have to agree to, and it's got how God knows how many sponsors and third parties and sending you all sorts of things, and they lump it all together in one permission. And certainly I've seen quite a few on LinkedIn recently, actually, which I keep sort of writing the companies down and think I must send them an email and basically explain that maybe that's not what they ought to be doing.
Yeah. And in terms of the lead buyers of lead generators potentially doing something wrong, what's who suffers the consequences from this sort of ICO level? So let's say it was a consent thing or an ASA, there's a problem with the advert. How does the brand who is buying the leads, how are they impacted, and what can they do to stop that?
They can certainly be impacted. Obviously, the ICO announced earlier this month, I think, that they have reprimands that they give out to people, so they can do a monetary penalty notice, but they had a more informal thing of reprimands where they get a complaint and they deal with it in a more low-key way. But those reprimands, you never used to know what was going on, but now they're actually up on the ICO's website. So actually, I did have a little bit of a chuckle when I read that, because actually it's gone up there this month, but they've actually backdated the reprimands that have gone on there. So if you were involved in one of them with the ICO last year, your name is going to be on their website.
I'll have
now.
to take a look at that. It'd be interesting to see if we know anyone. Yeah.
But and it's interesting because obviously when those cases were going through, they all thought it was going to be confidential and nobody would know. But suddenly now, I think it's 26 companies had ones last year that are now on that page on the website.
And it's bad PR more than anything. And even in the terms of the fines, it's the bad PR harms them more.
It is. It's definitely the PR, the sort of the influence that even being involved in some way, because the other thing that the ICO has now started doing is in its monetary penalty notice, if you read them, it used to basically redact any of the names of any third parties that were involved in the case. So if they investigated a brand who bought data from a company, they used to redact the name of that company, but they've stopped doing that. So if you've supplied data to somebody quite legitimately and they've gone and misused it and they get investigated, your name's going to be within that monetary penalty.
And the same vice versa, I'm assuming, if they bought it as well.
Exactly. And that's a thing, I think, for if you're buying data, you really need to be careful and do your due diligence, because yes, if a company gets investigated because they're selling data wrongly and you've bought it and you haven't done that, then the effect on your reputation could be significant, depending on, especially the bigger you are, the more the effect could be.
Yeah, because I think what happens in a lot of instances is that a lead buyer will just be in contact with the lead generator. They'll take a cursory glance at a landing page or a site or something, think, oh, it looks legit, the colors look good, or it looks well designed or whatever, and then just start buying leads. They might even do a bit of due diligence, but it's not necessarily like as in depth as what are the consent mechanisms, are the opt-ins 100%, how are they like storing the data, how are they going to transfer it to us? And we still have some clients that think it becomes like a battle, that think transferring people's personal data via email is okay. And it's like, it's 2023, you can't do this anymore.
Yeah, no, I there's an awful lot of people that are sort of not going to the extent they ought to, especially given yes, it is now 2023 and things are changing, and I think people are far more aware of what's happening with their personal data, and therefore they're more likely to complain as well if things go wrong, which is then going to be a more likely that maybe the ASA or the ICO become aware of you.
Yeah.
Janine, I like to kind of end these podcasts by giving people a thought to take home with them if they should want to consider this on their evening, but people listening, they tend to be either lead buyers or lead generators selling leads. What from your perspective, should they be wary of? Should they be thinking about? Are there any mistakes that maybe they're making, but maybe they don't even know they're making? Something you commonly see is an error that people are making that they need to sort of consider at the end of this.
I think to a certain extent, this thing about when you're even just because you're doing a simple lead generation thing, like you've got a white paper or you're going to run a free webinar, make sure that you do have your permissions properly collected, because you're going to go through all that effort, especially if you're going to run a webinar, and if you haven't collected the right consent for you or for a co-sponsor or somebody, another third party, then that's going to be a complete waste of time. But also, as we were talking earlier about due diligence, that is, I think, it's going to be one of the buzzwords, I think, for 2023. Due diligence has got to be a lot more thought through, but also do it properly right to the end. Don't do just a cursory glance, as you were saying, Simon, about the you need to go past what's on the form and go behind it and see what happens when somebody presses that button. Where do they go? How are you looking after it? How is it going to be stored? And just make sure that you're completely happy with the way that any data that you might be buying, for example, or that you want to sell to somebody, there's going to be no argument over its good quality data. It's one of those things of quality, not quantity. It's got to be king.
Yeah, great.
Janine, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been very nice to have someone in a slightly different role to to the guests we normally have. It's been interesting to have someone who can talk us through this and more than just us speculating about things. Actually, have an expert here, so we really appreciate it. You've been a fantastic guest. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome. It was an enjoyable session.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was episode 91, the C Word. Thanks for listening to the B2C Lead Generation podcast. Be sure to hit subscribe to hear more from those at the very cutting edge of the lead gen world.